the house across the street. For health reasons regarding my husband's mother, we had to move from our home in Ensenada to a small town in San Quintin, Baja California. Within just a few years, she had lost her husband, then the son who used to take care of her, and suddenly she was left all alone, too weak to maintain her home or the small farm animals that once helped them survive. With all the savings we had and a small loan, my husband finally quit his job, and we headed to that town to try and start a small business and take care of his mother. She had always been like a second mother to me, so I completely agreed. I went first with her, along with my baby, while my husband finished the necessary arrangements in Ensenada. She welcomed me warmly, full of gratitude, and I was happy to help her. But that sense of happiness would soon fade. On my second day, after tending the animals, I was exhausted. I was mentally preparing myself to do it all again the next morning, thinking it would just take me a few days to get used to the routine. But past 10 o'clock at night, a woman's desperate cry for help woke me up. It came from the house across the street, which I believed to be abandoned, at least judging from the neglected yard. I peeked through the window, waiting to see if maybe my imagination was playing tricks on me. But then I heard the cry again, and this time, a man's voice shouted at her to shut up. Not wanting to wake my mother-in-law, I called the police. I told them it sounded like a woman was being beaten in the house across the street. The screams continued for a while, but the police never came. I couldn't sleep, worried for that poor woman. I remember crying myself to sleep, imagining the hell my neighbor must have been living in. The next morning, I didn't mention it to my mother-in-law over breakfast. I didn't want to worry her. But I did look more carefully at that house across the street. It really did look completely abandoned. Something terrible happened there, I thought. That very night, I heard her again, a woman begging for help. It was just past 10 o'clock. Again, the man shouted at her to shut up. This time, I called the police again, demanding they show up, or I would file a complaint. About 10 minutes later, they arrived. I was already waiting outside since my baby was asleep. One of the officers shined his flashlight a few times across the house, then got back into the patrol car. When I realized they were about to leave, I ran after them, begging them to at least knock on the door and make sure the woman was safe. "Was it you who called?" one of them asked, looking at me with little concern. I nodded. Both of them stepped out. "Come with us," one of them said. We approached the front gate. The officer pushed it slightly, and it creaked open. "We're going to step inside," he said, "just so you can see what's really going on here." I didn't quite understand what he meant, but I followed. They walked up to the porch and asked me to come closer. The main door was locked. The windows were covered in dust. They shined their flashlights inside. What I saw was a house in complete abandonment, a few pieces of old furniture, total darkness. It was clear no one had lived there for a very long time. I apologized to the police. Maybe I had been mistaken, maybe the cries came from somewhere else. "Don't worry, ma'am," one of them replied. "You're not the first person to report this. Just keep your window closed and try to sleep." They left, and I was left even more confused. The next morning, I had no choice but to bring it up to my mother-in-law. What she told me left me stunned. She knew exactly who it was. A married couple had lived in that house, with their 2 children. The husband was a regular man most of the time, but whenever he drank, his true self emerged, violent, cruel, especially towards his wife and children. The woman always tried to defend her kids, so she became the target of his abuse. My mother-in-law had once called the police, but they never came. When her late husband, my father-in-law, found out, he told her not to get involved, that those were marital problems and not their business. Of course not, I interrupted. That kind of violence must be reported. Doing nothing is the same as allowing it. I know, she said. But your father-in-law was raised on a ranch. He would never have treated me like that, but he had this idea that you shouldn't meddle. One night, she continued, we both heard her screams for help. Horrible cries. The children sobbed uncontrollably. I eventually convinced my husband to call someone. But it was too late when the police arrived. The poor woman, she was already dead from so many beatings. The children were in hysterics. The man was never found. Some say he was seen running toward the ocean, walking into the water, never to return. Your father-in-law never forgave himself for not helping sooner. He carried that guilt to his grave. And those screams you've heard, I believe they're meant for me. As punishment, for not defending those poor children. Tears filled her eyes as she finished. That was enough for me to believe her. That very evening, I placed candles at the entrance of the house across the street, and I prayed the rosary with my mother-in-law every day. The cries still came, but not every night anymore. Instead of hiding, I would open the window and look straight at that house, pitying the poor woman who died without help, as if she were completely alone in the world. In time, new tenants arrived. A cousin of the woman, with her husband. Not a very happy couple. We learned they had cared for the children for a while after that terrible night, before sending them to live with their maternal grandmother in a small town in Sonora. There, they could live peacefully. From the moment those relatives moved into the house, the screams were never heard again. But even today, when I remember them, my blood runs cold, and sadness overwhelms me.
The Cry of La Llorona in Tlatelolco. I live with my brother and my mother in the Guerrero neighborhood of Mexico City, just a few steps away from Tlatelolco. We've lived here since we were kids, back when friends would tell each other stories and legends about these streets. But the first time we truly got scared, we were already teenagers. We had just come back from a party, a friend of my best friend Pedro. It was held right in Tlatelolco, and we were walking home past 1 in the morning. I once heard La Llorona around here, Pedro said, right at the corner where we were about to turn. We thought he was joking, but he went on very seriously. My dad says he saw her too. He lived here his whole life. I only heard her once. Did she sound close or far? I asked. Because they say when she sounds far away, that's when she's actually closest to you. It sounded like she was just around the corner. I heard her right about here, he said, taking a few steps forward. I heard her, but she wasn't crying out my children like people say. She was just sobbing. A wail that echoed through the street, through the walls. It got inside your chest. That's how I knew it wasn't just some woman needing help. I ran the other way, circled several blocks before I got home. We laughed a little, though Pedro didn't find it funny. We kept walking. The street where he said he had heard her was indeed eerie, but only at night for some reason. And I'm not even talking about crime. There was just something different in the air, something cold. The next day, almost as if confirming the story, Dona Isabel, the lady from the corner store, sold us some bread and a gallon of milk for dinner, even though she was about to close. Hurry home, she told us. These days, people have been hearing La Llorona again. We laughed again, but this time nervously. My brother and I exchanged looks, half disbelieving, half unsettled by the coincidence. You've heard her yourself, Dona Isabel? We asked. I've seen her, she answered seriously. Not dressed in white like they say. Not pale. No, she's a horrible vision. A woman in black, with long hair blending into her dress. Her face is terrifying, like the skin had been torn away. I saw her float by, about half a meter above the ground. Then she disappeared. A moment later, I saw her figure appear again in the distance. Be careful walking home. It's too late to be out on nights like this. A little unsettled, we walked on. We tried to laugh again, not taking the story of an old woman too seriously. At least that's what we wanted to believe. That night, I remember listening to La Mano Peluda on the radio, right up until I fell asleep. The next thing I remember was my brother shaking me violently awake. I opened my eyes and saw his terrified face. "What is it?" I asked. "Listen." And then I heard it. A wailing. Not the cry of a woman, but something else. Something unnatural. It came from the street, growing louder and louder, as if it were approaching. It wasn't just sound. We felt it, in the floor, in the bed, deep in our chests. I jumped up and we ran to the window. From there we could barely see a piece of the street. But the crying grew closer, closer still. I thought I saw a shadow turn the corner. Figure just for a second. I quickly closed the curtain and stepped back. The wail was deafening now. And then it stopped moving. It was as if whatever was making that sound had stopped right in front of our house. I begged my brother to lie back down. Even though he wasn't a child anymore, I saw him pull the blanket over his head. I lay down too, staring at the window, unable to even blink. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the wailing began to fade, growing distant again. Minutes later, our bedroom door opened. It was our mother checking in on us. We never spoke about that night again. And when neighbors tell us they've seen her too, this is the first time I've ever shared my story. Not even our mother knows.
The woman in the window. I had been sharing the same apartment for over a year when one of my roommates decided to move in with his girlfriend. The moment he told us, I immediately claimed his room, the only one with a view of the street. My other roommate agreed, so I moved my things in. With all the light coming through the window, I felt much better, more motivated to work. And since I work from home, it was difficult to do so in my old room, where the only window faced the parking lot. This building, located on a street in Colonia Cuauhtémoc, Mexico City, had one peculiar detail: it stood directly across from one of the last remaining houses in the area. Almost the entire street had been filled with apartment buildings, some luxurious, some modest. But that one house across from me looked exactly as it must have decades ago. An elderly man lived there. He had the habit of standing by the window, watching life go by. Always in a sleeveless undershirt. Always with the same expression. Behind him, almost always, I could see a woman. His wife, I thought. She never seemed interested in looking out the window like he did. She stood a little further back, barely visible in the shadows. Since my desk was right beside my window, they were the first thing I saw whenever I lifted my eyes from my computer. One afternoon, the old man noticed me watching. He stared right back at me, didn't lower his gaze for a single second, until I grew uncomfortable and had to look away. That same evening, I saw her. The woman. Sitting on the bed by the window, barely illuminated by the fading daylight, staring at me just as intently. A few days later, I came home and saw an ambulance parked in front of the house. My heart sank. I hoped they were okay. The next day, Donna Laura, the building's concierge, confirmed my fears. Don Armando passed away, she told me before I could even ask. The Lord finally took him so he could rest. That's terrible, I said. I always saw him at his window. And how's his wife doing? Wife? She asked, looking genuinely confused. Yes, the lady who lived with him. The one who stood behind him at the window. Her face changed. No, young man. Don Armando always lived alone in that house. She crossed herself right there and walked away, leaving me speechless. From that day on, she never spoke to me again. And from that day on, I've kept my curtains shut, even if it means losing the sunlight. I'm just waiting for the chance to move back into my old room, the one with a view of the parking lot.